Welcome to the virtual meeting of the Live Well South Tees Health and Wellbeing Board. Can I remind all participants that normal rules of procedure apply? For example, comments, questions need to be directed to the chair. As we are meeting virtually, proceedings may take slightly longer, so your patience is appreciated. As per our virtual meeting procedure, if questions have been received prior to the meeting, I will call on the relevant participants at the appropriate time to raise the question. If you are invited to speak, please state your name and be as specific as possible about which issue it is you are speaking to. While members of the public can view this meeting via YouTube live, they will not be able to actively participate or comment on proceedings. As this meeting is being live streamed, can I remind all participants that their conduct should reflect this. Thank you. We'll now start the meeting. I would like to welcome everybody. This is the first time I've taken the chair at the Live Well South Tees, and I hope you all bear with me, although I have chaired committees before. I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm not going to ask everybody to introduce themselves, because if you have any questions or comments to make, would you please say your name and what position you hold when you ask the question or make a statement. I would like to speak, and Chair, very best, and get well soon. Thank you. Apologies for absent, Caroline, please.
Sorry, I think Sue's got those.
I've got those there, Chair. So we've got councillors Lanigan, Smiles, Catherine Bolton, David Gallagher, Steve Johnson, Tony Parkinson, Sue Butcher, Dr. Ali, Dr. Walker, Brent Kilmurray, Mark Davis, Catherine Warnock and John Sampson.
Thank you, Susan. Can I ask, do we have any declaration of interest in this meeting today? I'll take that as a no. Yes? Anybody showed hands? Okay. Can we look at the minutes of the last meeting held on the 2nd of June? Can we take these as a full record, or does anybody have any comments they would like to make on those minutes? I'll take that as a no. Thank you. Now can we continue with the meeting and go to item number 5, which is the development items. I do believe this is going to be presented. Is it by you, Catherine?
Yeah, I'll share this. Dominic's going to start us off, and then myself, Tina and Richie will play into the presentation, but I'll share my screen if that's okay whenever people are ready.
Yeah, can we take this presentation from you, and would you prefer questions as we go along, or would you like us to wait till the end?
So there's quite a few slides to get through. So what we've done is we've just put a couple of pause for reflection slides throughout the presentation. So we'll pause at 2 or 3 points during the presentation, and then we've made sure within the time for the agenda item, there's plenty of room for discussion at the end as well.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you. So carry on, please.
Okay, so Catherine, are you sharing the screen? Yeah.
Should be coming anytime.
Okay, so just by way of introduction, my name's Dominic Gardner, because I know there's a number of people in the meeting who aren't normally in the meeting, and I'm Director of Operations for Teesside for Tees Escamilla Valleys. Catherine, I don't know if you've already done an introduction, but do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Catherine Parker, Consultant in Public Health for Public Health South Tees.
So I suppose just by general way of context, we're conscious that at the last Health and Wellbeing Board, Mark Adams gave a presentation that was very much focused on the broad impacts of COVID, focusing on some of the physical health impacts, but also in terms of some of the health inequalities, etc. Within that, there were a couple of references to mental health, and what we'd agreed was that we would provide some further information for the board in the shape of this presentation. There's also an accompanying paper, which I believe people have had the opportunity to read. So in terms of this presentation, what we're going to be looking to do within this is to consider some of the mental health challenges that are being faced as a result of COVID. We've used the language post-COVID there, but we know are absolutely not post-COVID. But some of the mental health challenges that are occurring as a result of the COVID pandemic, and also to start some thoughts and some considerations around the response of the whole system to the challenges outlined. And in terms of supporting the conversation and supporting the kind of understanding of the issues, we just wanted to be really clear that what we were doing was we were taking a place-based approach to it. So we're absolutely focusing on a geographical place, in this case South Tees, and not on individual organisations. And the session's been designed around something called the Population Intervention Triangle. So again, just to reflect the fact that this is a multi-dimensional issue, what we're identifying within the Population Intervention Triangle is that there are numerous levels of response. So there's a civic level response, which is kind of the things that need to happen that impact absolutely everybody who lives within the area. There's kind of community level response, so where we've got some specific issues and programs around community protective factors, and within that we'll get some specific reference to the establishments of a wellbeing network. And beyond that, we'll have some consideration of the roles of services in terms of meeting some of that demand that's coming through in terms of mental health issues. So what we're trying to get across very clearly is that it's a whole system issue, and that no one organisation has got the answers to all of the issues that will be highlighted. So if we could move on. So in terms of broad outline for the session, just building on that, the early part of the session, I'm going to be describing some of the predictions that have been identified in terms of increased demand for mental health services. I think everybody's very much aware, well, I'm assuming most people will be aware that mental health has been something that's been spoken about quite broadly during the course of the pandemic. And I think that's been one of the really positive things in terms of the profile of mental health and the willingness of people to talk about the impact of that both within communities and individuals. We'll be looking at the importance of some of the social determinants of mental health. So we know that in terms of people who experience mental health issues and mental health difficulties, we know that often their social context can have a really significant impact on that in terms of either creating those mental health issues or reinforcing the mental health issues they may be experiencing. We'll be looking, as I say, at how we protect mental health well-being at the community level, and then also some of the service level response in future plans. And then also at the end of the presentation, we'll be looking to have a conversation in terms of the role of the Health and Wellbeing Board. So kind of what is the ask of the Health and Wellbeing Board in terms of the issues that we've highlighted. So if we just move past that one. So this slide just describes, so if we move on to the next slide as well, Catherine, and just basically what I'm going to describe to you are some predictions or forecasting in terms of demand that have been developed by a range of individuals, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but it's been driven by the Mental Health and Learning Disability and Autism Partnership, which is a relationship that Tees, Escombe, Wear Valleys have with the commissioners in terms of supporting the development of the mental health system across the Tees Valley and Durham and Darlington. In terms of the slide that you can see in front of you, the line that I want to highlight is the red line. So you can see that there's a kind of, this is where you see that I'm slightly colourblind. There's kind of a lilac line there, which is the first wave, which is relating to physical mortality and morbidity as a result of COVID-19. The green line looks at the potential impact in terms of the second wave, in terms of the impact of resource restriction that occurred during the COVID period, during the initial stages of the pandemic on non-COVID conditions. And there's a lot of focus in terms of NHS getting back up to normal, etc. The third wave, which is that blue line, is around the impact of the pandemic upon people who may have had long-term chronic conditions and any interruption to the care that they may have received. But just to be really clear, the red line is relating to the additional demand and the impact of COVID in terms of mental health issues for people within our communities. And as you can see, the red line actually starts immediately following the first wave and then continues for a prolonged period of time and reaches a peak that's kind of higher than the other lines. So this is a slide that has been produced and has been, I think it's been through this Health and Wellbeing Board before, but it's commonly been used to kind of give a sense of the timing of the health impacts of COVID pandemic. And what we're going to do now is move on to some further slides that will describe in a little bit more detail what that red line, what is driving that red line and what it may consist of. So Catherine, if you're happy to move on. So in terms of the overall model, it was developed by, as I say, public health leads. So Edward Kanonga has been central to this, who used to be the Director of Public Health within South Tees. They've been using research and empirical evidence to support with that, clinical data, and involved members of the clinical commissioning group, the Tees Valley and Durham and Darlington clinical commissioning groups, to look at the impact across Durham and Tees. It's been based upon life course age bands. So broadly speaking, we're talking about children and young people up to the age of 18. We're talking about people, what we class as working age adults between the ages of 64, and then for older people for that 64 plus onwards. The model looked at segments of the population who might have had a similar experience in terms of COVID-19 and risk factors. And as I say, it's used the research to estimate the increased prevalence of mental illnesses within each of those segments. And it can be used to give a sense of potential increased demand for any geographically defined population. So if we move on to the next model, next slide, sorry. So I suppose the initial point on that slide is saying that once suppressed existing demand has bounced back in the next few weeks, we will then see a, well, I think in reality, what we saw within mental health services was that there was an initial suppression in terms of demand. We did see that reduce a little. So we saw demand for our kind of routine care services or our non-urgent care services very significantly reduced across adults, older people and children's services. But what we, and also similar for urgent care services. So we saw a reduction in referrals to our crisis teams. We saw reductions in occupancy within our adult and older people's acute inpatient wards. What we saw quite early on, probably around about the May time, was that we saw an increase then in terms of urgent care presentations. So what we saw very quickly was a return to kind of pre-COVID levels of referrals into crisis teams and our more acute services. And actually what we've seen is that some of that surge has now continued to give us levels of referrals into those services that are higher than they were pre-COVID. And what we've also started to see now is very clearly the bounce back in terms of demand for our routine care services. So for our community mental health teams across adults and older people. That bounce back is slower in children's services, but we'd absolutely anticipate that with children returning to school, we'll start to see kind of an increase in referrals from there. So the forecast looks at the volume of additional demands over the next 5 years. And I suppose it describes, I've talked there about kind of TUVE's experience of the pandemic. One of the things we need to be really clear about is that this is a prediction around of people who require some form of support for their mental health and emotional well-being. It doesn't necessarily mean that will all be provided by TUVE by any stretch of the imagination, because we know that primary care, we know that the VCS, we know that local authority services all provide significant levels of support to by far probably the greatest number of people who would fall within that kind of overall system of service provision. But this is the bit where the scary music needs to be played, if we had any. So in terms of numbers, what the model is suggesting is that the equivalent of 52% of children and young people who over the next 5 years may need to come and receive some support in terms of their emotional and mental health and well-being. So that's a blunt number over 5 years. So that may, you know, for the purposes of planning, they've chunked it up in kind of 10% per year. It won't fall that kind of naturally, but that is a really significant number of young people who have been affected as a result of the pandemic. In terms of working age adults, we're talking about an additional 23% in relation to existing prevalence. And then for older people, it's dropped off the slide. We're talking about around about the same number, but around about 22% increase in demand is what we're expecting. So in terms of what's driving that increase in demand, if you want to move to the next slide. Yeah, so if we moved on to the next one after that, because I've kind of talked through that, Catherine, if that's okay. So what we think we'll see in terms of children and young people is we know that for school-age children and young people, there's been enormous disruption in terms of their schooling and their social networks. We know that actually there are some, we're hearing anecdotally that there are some positives about that. So young people who were initially anxious about their school performance and relationships within schools, the experience of lockdown and not attending school had initial positive impact. But we know that the longer the lockdown went down and the longer young people were out of school, the more that we then saw that disruption of their social networks, which is really important at that point in your life. It's important at any point in life, but it's especially important when you're a young person. And we know, we only have to look at some of the anxiety that has been around educational attainment, the exam results over the last month or so, to understand the impact of not attending school regularly and the impact that may have on young people's life chances. There will be children and young people who've been subject to recent or past trauma. There'll be children and young people who've got special educational needs or learning disabilities. And I suppose what we would see there potentially would be the impacts of, if someone's got a learning disability, the impact of an additional mental health issue developing alongside that. There'll be illness caused by vicarious experience. So we know we will have children who will have relatives who've worked in ICU, who've been worked as kind of key workers throughout this pandemic, who've all been exposed to very traumatic and difficult experiences, and there'll be a vicarious impact for some young people. And then back to the social determinants, we'll absolutely see the impacts of those kind of multiple risk factors in terms of poverty and the inequalities that actually COVID is only likely. So if we move on to the next slide, Catherine, if that's okay. In terms of kind of 18 plus, so where do we think in terms of working age adults we're going to see the additional demand from? So we think we'll be seeing that in terms of, as I say, kind of key workers. We think that'll be in terms of people who've got long-term physical conditions, who will not have had the continuity of care that they may have had previously. And we know long-term physical conditions are often associated or have comorbid mental health issues identified in terms of the individuals who experience that. We know there'll be the impact of loneliness and the disruption to social networks for one-person households, shielded households, the impact of lost income, and then the impact upon people with pre-existing mental illnesses. We also know that there will be a low volume, high needs group of people who've had experience of COVID and who may have had some form of cognitive impact or neurological impact as a result of issues in relation to oxygen deprivation, or also individuals who've got some form of almost PTSD type presentation associated with their experience of COVID as well. For older adults, what we absolutely expect to see will be increased risk in relation to vascular dementia, but we're also very clear that, again, that disruption to social networks, that social isolation will in many cases have had an impact in terms of the mental health of the older population as well. So just in terms of the broader conversation about the modelling, so there are some risks in terms of the accuracy of the predictions or the forecasting. So there are research gaps, and there are gaps in the sense that some of this has been based on other, and the word similar issues there in inverted commas, in terms of other traumatic events that have happened in the past. What we've got with COVID is something that we haven't had before because of the chronicity that we're dealing with, so the long-term nature of that. The sensitivity to the population segments is also something that we need to continue to work through. And then within this, there will, of course, nobody fits neatly into one segment. There'll be people who fit into multiple segments. As I've said, there is a kind of an assumption just to support with initial planning that in terms of a time profile, there is, there's that query about, do you go to a one-off jump to a new normal? How do you predict at what point those people will be coming into the system? So at the minute, it's just kind of being segmented for planning purposes into 5 years demand over 60 equal months. But we might expect to see some sharp initial impacts in there. It'll probably come in waves. I think would probably be the most logical way to look at that. So forecast is being refined every month. And I actually got a new version of this yesterday that was too late to share, but I am happy to share. That gives a little bit more detail than we've got in this presentation. But again, just in terms of the validity of the numbers, there are a number of models that have been used throughout the country. And in terms of the model that's being used here, it seems to be describing numbers and impacts that are broadly similar to that which have been described by the other models throughout the country. So it looks as if it does hold a degree of validity at this point in time. So at that point, I'll hand over to Catherine.
Thanks, Dominic. So I guess the question then for the system is how then we start to respond to some of this demand at a system level. And what you can see on the screen there is essentially it's just a pictorial version of what Dominic was describing before. It's the population intervention triangle. We think this gives us a really nice framework in which to consider our responses. And what we're going to do in the next couple of sections, myself and Tina and Richie from the public health team, who I'll ask to introduce themselves as they get to their slides, is just unpack why, in addition to having a really robust service response, our action as a system at civic and community levels is absolutely crucial. So we know that health services responses only account for a proportion of health outcomes, and the remainder is about the conditions in which people live, the conditions in which they're born, they grow, they live, work and age. So our service response must be supported by that action at a civic and community level. And at a community level, we really know that community life matters for health outcomes. So the extent to which we have control over our lives, we have good social connections and we live in safe neighbourhoods, all of these are important influences on good mental health. So these community determinants, we know, protect good mental health, but also buffer against some of the risk factors that people have been experiencing, particularly and potentially more acutely during COVID. So Tina and Richie are going to explore some of the community aspects in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to unpack some of the civic level interventions. So Dominic has specifically highlighted some of the financial insecurity risk as something that was contributing to demand. So I'll focus on that element. But in a nutshell, civic level interventions are those interventions that have got real potential to reach high numbers of people. So it might be about policy and strategy development or legislation, or our approaches to welfare, economic development and job creation, or it might be about how we communicate and what our information campaigns are. So as such, these are really effective in addressing those kind of social determinants of health, as I said before, these conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work and age. So it's really important as a system to think about the impact of things like socioeconomic status and employment as part of our mental health response. And we know that financial security is a key determinant of mental health. So just linked to that, we know poverty increases the risk of mental health problems, and it can be both a causal factor and a consequence of mental ill health. And that's because financial insecurity makes it really difficult to avoid stress and control in our lives, to access and experiences and material resources, to adopt and maintain those healthy behaviours, and really to feel the safety of that financial safety net that so many people rely on. So how that plays out locally, this data is pre-COVID data, but you can see there that we've got a challenging baseline already. So nationally, we know that children and adults who are living in households in the lowest 20% income bracket are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop mental health problems than those that are in the highest. And when you look at our baseline pre-COVID across South Tees, you can see we've got higher numbers of children living in low-income families, higher level of long-term claimants of job seekers allowance, higher proportion of fuel poverty and lower overall employment. And the contributing factors to poverty itself are really complex and are overlapping. And I've put just a few of these down, but might be worth exploring when we come to our discussions later, people's experiences of what those contributing factors are for people locally and how they manifest themselves. But things like poor physical and mental health, as we've said, is both a consequence and a causal factor of poverty, people's level of debt and their access to affordable credit, tax and rent arrears, worklessness, and that can be intergenerational worklessness or worklessness that spans across communities. Our local economy and the nature of local opportunities has a real impact. Poor educational attainment and access to educational opportunities, and things like the benefit structure. So you can see with those, complex and overlapping factors, people can become trapped in cycles of poverty. And whilst much of that is controlled at a national level, there's really effective local action that can be taken, and our financial inclusion groups have done significant work in this field, which I'll touch on in a minute.
Councillor Stevens would like to speak. Steve would like to speak.
That's very good, Steve Kelly. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah, good, thank you. Right. I heard that children seem to be potentially more affected by, as far as mental factors are concerned than adults. Because I might be odd, I think I am a bit odd to be honest, but if somebody had closed the school down for a few years even, I would have been delighted. And if somebody had told me I didn't have to take GCSE exams and A-level exams, I would have been delighted. And I think perhaps we imagine that children, just really want to attend school all the time and take all these stressful exams. And I'm not convinced of that myself. I do, however, accept that if children miss school, they will be possibly badly affected in the sort of race for life, you might call it, which we're all affected by, perhaps a bit unfortunately, because at that age, I think we could perhaps put too much stress on academic attainments. But anyway, that's a personal view. I do believe that the question of poverty, which has just been raised, is an important one, because that, I think, puts people under real stress. And yet, I think the figure was only 20-odd% increase amongst adults and older people. That's where I would think that the main mental health problems really lie. And I just wonder, are we building up a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy here? If we mental health, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I said I thought saving lives was top of the agenda. This person thought that no, mental health was even higher than saving lives, and we did. I just hope we're not setting an agenda which, it becomes a factor in causing more people to come for mental health services when in times gone by they might have soldiered on and in fact overcome short-term problems, at least themselves. So I'm a bit of a cynic about some of these things. Perhaps somebody would like to comment, or I'm sure would disagree with me.
Chair, it's just conscious that what we said we were going to do is we're going to build some breaks into the presentation for questions. And it's quite a long presentation, so I think we've got a break at the end of this section. But if Councillor Kay is okay, what we could do is hold that question until that point and then come back to it then.
Okay.
Yes, I'm sure that will be all right. Okay, thank you. Carry on, please.
I finished for now, thank you.
Catherine, we've lost you.
To me. That's it. Thank you. I said, Caroline, I've lost my ability to mute and unmute while I'm screen sharing. So if you would be happy to mute me again when I'm finished presenting, that'd be helpful just to avoid background noise. Thank you.
I will do. Thanks, Catherine.
Okay, so a little bit of local context, which is some feedback from our Citizens Advice Bureau here, just to put some of that stuff into context locally for us. So what they're telling us is that they've seen increases in some types of inquiries since lockdown. So things like welfare benefit inquiries up from 30 to 55% of their overall queries, employment related queries significantly up, and issues around those, around unemployment, concerns about reduced hours and pay cuts. They've actually seen a reduction in debt-related inquiries, and that's gone from about 30% of their queries down to about 12%. And we think this is mainly due to lenders and landlords giving repayment holidays. So this is something that's likely to rapidly increase once that period ends. So we may need to be ready to respond to that. And overall, they've just reported seeing increased mental health and anxiety over the impacts of COVID on personal finances. So just to credit really the financial inclusion groups with this slide, a lot of this work is their mainstay work that they've been doing. So a number of you on the board may very well be closely related to and involved in some of this work. So just to give a flavour of some of the things that are in place that we'll be able to build on and have been as part of the COVID response. So there is the food poverty partnerships and the Food Power Alliance in Middlesbrough, which has a wide-ranging action plan addressing all elements of food poverty. We have food banks across both boroughs, an affordable warmth partnership and action plan again across South Tees. We have access to welfare rights advice across South Tees to ensure benefits are being claimed and signposting to those in debt to Citizens Advice Bureau, which is the main source for debt management support. There have been loan shark awareness campaigns, promotion of community banks and approved loans, and programmes such as Stop the Knock in Middlesbrough, which is very much a helping hand approach, which reframes how we think about council tax arrears, very much around supporting the individuals and getting to the root of the problems around their council tax arrears, rather than simply looking at the claims element and really seeing it as a red flag that there may be other things going on in this individual's life that we can support with. Looking at initiatives, things like poverty proofing the school day, and again linking that to food poverty, but also things like uniform policies, and enhanced needs pathways in our Healthy Child programme, making sure that those families in need are identified and given additional support where they need it, and signposting to community support across both local authorities. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavour of the types of things that are already going on and potentially that we could build on. So I'm just going to pause at that point and see if there's anything from Dominic's presentation or from anything else said that people would like to comment on or question. And we've allocated about 5 minutes for each of these slots to make sure we've got plenty of time at the end. So I'll hand back to you, Chair.
So, Chair, would it be helpful if I perhaps responded to Councillor Kay's comment from earlier on? Or
yes, please. Would you do that now? And if anybody else has any questions, could you let me know, please?
Okay. So Councillor Kay, I suppose, cognizant of the if your comment around in the past, people have kind of perhaps haven't come forward or help and have kind of soldiered on and kind of managed to find their way through the kind of the difficulties they may have been experiencing. I suppose in response to that there are so one of the things that is very well recognised across all mental health systems across the world is that the prevalence of mental illness, or the existence or the level of mental illness in a population, there's always a really significant gap between that prevalence and what converts into demand for mental health services. And that level of conversion into demand is influenced by a number of factors. It's influenced by things like people's mental health literacy, their ability to talk about their emotions and understand them. It's influenced by education. So, as I say, the understanding element of their mental health education, their ability to name the experiences that they're having. And it's also influenced by availability of services as well. So I think your point, the point that you've made, absolutely in the past, there will have been people who will have found a way forward and managed that themselves. I think the other issue is, though, that there will be a significant number of people who haven't been able to find a way forward, or it's taken longer for them to find a way forward. And actually, what we're suggesting within this is that as part of a whole system approach, it's not always necessarily formal treatment and support, treatment and therapy that is the answer. Often it is the things that are kind of wrapped up in some of those social determinants. Often it's some very practical advice, support and guidance that people get from kind of VCS or local authority support as well. So I think that I just kind of wanted to make that point in response to that. And in terms of the issue around children and young people that you raised, so I think you're right. I think for some young people, the prospect of not going to school would have been a delight at the outset. I think it's probably more the impact. There will be the longer term impact in terms of educational attainment and life chances. There's also the impact upon young people's social networks and their ability to socialise with their friends, which is really important in terms of that kind of their developmental stage at the point where they're kind of thinking about separating from parents and going, starting to kind of create their own identity. And then I think the other thing that we probably need to recognise is that there seems to be an increase in prevalence in terms of mental illness and emotional distress amongst children and young people, and that was being identified pre the pandemic. So I think there's kind of a whole complex set of factors that come together.
Thank you for that, Dominic. Dominic, could I ask you a question, please? What are we actually going to have in place to deal with this? Because you're going to have a huge amount of young people that are going to be referred to your for help from you. How are we going to deal with this, and how are we dealing with the people that we couldn't contact during the lockdown? How are you actually dealing with that at the moment?
So can I come to that in the second part of the presentation? Because the second part of the presentation describes some of the response. And I think some of the describes the service response. But what Catherine is describing is some of the kind of real absolute ground level building blocks that can have as much of an impact for people as well in terms of that community and civic response as well. But I will have to come to that.
Yeah, there's
Councillor.
Before I bring in Councillor Ovens, can I just say one other thing is that I've noticed a huge difference in my own family, my own granddaughter, from going back to school. This little girl has changed overnight with being back at school with her friends, which I think is amazing, and I'm glad now that the children have gone back to school. So I'll bring Councillor Mary Ovens in now, please.
Thank you. I wasn't quite sure whether you could see I was indicating, because I don't seem to be able to send chat with a clue. There was a couple of things, just declaring a declaration of interest, really, and that I have a family member that works at Rosebery Park. But apart from that, it was just, I think we might be mopping up a few more problems, because in the initial stages of lockdown, there was lots and lots of community support and people going in and out of vulnerable people's homes, elderly, and that's been sort of withdrawn a little bit as we've had more freedom to get out and about, and people have been encouraged to do that. I think with the dark nights coming along, we've got some problems ahead of us. Not just with young people, with people of all ages, but particularly the elderly, which I'm sure we're going to come on to at some point. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Evans. Have we anything else we need to add, or can we continue, please? Can we continue, Catherine, please?
Introduce yourself. Oh, I've been unmuted again. Thank you. If I can ask Tina to introduce herself, and then Richie, when it comes to your slide, if you can introduce yourself as you start. Thank you.
Hello there. Introduce myself. Tina Walker. I'm an advanced public health practitioner for Public Health South Tees, and I'm the mental health and wellbeing lead. So I'll be taking you through a few slides which is to do with the community level response, protecting mental health and wellbeing. So in this part of the presentation, we'll be looking at community-centred interventions to reduce health inequalities and looking at those protective factors within our communities that impact on mental health and wellbeing. Obviously, while it's difficult to quantify the increase in prevalence of mental health, we can, in the meantime, utilise and explore those opportunities that currently exist to reduce and mitigate the risk. So to help us facilitate this, we've been looking at a mental wellbeing impact assessment, a toolkit for wellbeing. And the aim of the assessment is to maximise the positive and minimise the negative impacts on mental health and wellbeing. There is a clear relationship, between the overarching protected factors and mental wellbeing, and having a way of building our collective resilience to manage these uncertain times. The three overarching protecting factors used in the assessment can significantly influence the mental wellbeing of individuals, communities, and organisations. And you can see that table in front of you. So the three overarching protecting factors are enhancing control, increasing resilience and community assets, and facilitating, participating, and promoting inclusion. So if we identify the actions influence these factors individually and collectively to improve and sustain mental well-being, it does enable us to develop the capability and capacity to sort of build a collective and stronger sense of well-being that makes an impact now. So what we have to remember, we have all these protective factors, but these will be influenced by what Catherine was saying and Dominic was saying, by population characteristics, so age, physical health, your gender, ethnicity and race. And some, if you go back one, that's it, Catherine, stay there. And some, obviously, at the time, our shielded population, the wider determinants, financial security, employment and housing. And then those other relationships, our family, our community, our home, our civic society. So with control, lack of control and lack of influence, believing you can't influence decisions that affect your life, are independent risk factors for stress. So people who feel in control of their lives are more likely to feel able to take control of their health. And when we look at resilience, resilience is broadly defined as doing better than expected in the face of adversity. And community assets, communities have never been built on their deficiencies. Building community is always dependent upon mobilising the capacities and assets of people and place. And if people are participating, and this has been people who are involved and engaged in activities outside their immediate household, and includes things like cultural and leisure activities as well as volunteering. Next slide, please. So, responding to the mental health impacts, what can we do at a community level? So, I think I've moved on one more than I should have done there. Okay. Right. So, the public health, what we need is a prompt response to enhance mental health and well-being and to enhance those protective factors to mitigate any risks. So the public health teams across the North East are currently undertaking a rapid review to assess the impact on the mental health of the local population as a result of the pandemic. And this will contribute to a wider exercise across the region, which has been undertaken by the Mental Health Integrated Care System, the ICS. And this is to inform a kind of a regional picture of the local level of need and current provision, which will inform capacity planning and development. So there'll be a separate small rapid review for Middlesbrough and for Edgar and Cleveland. And obviously we're looking at all those protective factors and also looking at the baseline of mental health needs. Where are we already using things like our joint strategic needs assessment for mental health, and also to gather some local insights. So this work has to be completed by the end of September. So to facilitate this, we're sending out a short mental health COVID-19 recovery survey to a lot of our mental health, but mainly our wellbeing organisations and agencies, mainly just to sort of understand the work that they do, the current impact and challenges that are facing them. And what we'll do is we'll kind of touch base with them again in about 3 months, and then about 6 months' time, just like as a temperature check, just to see how things are changing. What we're kind of looking at through the rapid review is the themes that you can see on the slide there. So they're ranging for things like provider capacity, and that's things like we've got training out there. So we've got a training hub. There's a whole range of virtual training that's been available, recovery college, psychological first aid. So pushing a lots of training and awareness out there to our workforce. And then that capacity for early intervention, looking at our workplace interventions, our wellbeing offer in schools. And then, as you mentioned, for very importantly, community assets, promoting access to green space, activities, building on our volunteer support, our good neighbour schemes. You know, Mary Evans was saying there about there was a lot of supporting communities coming round to people's households, being a good neighbour. We need to make sure we kind of maintain that. And then self-help, Public Health England, you know, all of the Every Mind Matters campaign, the sort of other sort of wellbeing campaigns out there, social media platforms. I know in Red Clean they've got the Feel Good pages, which direct people to wellbeing, self-care services and digital inclusion programs. And obviously we'll make sure with collaboration that we continue to build on the existing partnership arrangements or develop new ones that kind of are working on all those common themes. So we have collaboration with the T Suicide Prevention Task Force, wellbeing offering schools, the financial inclusion groups. So let's make sure we keep those core. So as part of the review, we're going through all of that, then adding the insights and then the intelligence. And I think really it's just kind of, if anybody's got anything else, any other insights of local knowledge, please let me know. This will all go in that local picture of what we're developing. And then also there, just making sure that when we're considering that, all the characteristics, the wider determinants, that we're not leaving anybody behind. You know, are we kind of considering all of our population as a whole? Next slide, please. So the final one here, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here because you've got a few more detail at the end of your notes, but how the system leadership is being developed across South Tees to develop a prevention-focused approach. I think many people on the board are aware of the Prevention Concordat for mental health, and we'll be making sure that we kind of adopt this approach throughout all of our interventions. So the vision there, that's the vision for the Prevention Concordat. Both councils signed up to the Concordat in 2018, and last year Teesside University evaluated all those areas that had adopted the approach. For us, they found that the Concordat was integrated within lots of existing work streams, like the Crisis Care Concordat and the T Suicide Prevention Task Force. A life course approach had been adopted within many prevention action plans, and that there were examples of social resilience programmes. There was a recommendation that potentially prevention might have been a bit obscured within some of these work streams, and there needs to be a bit more of a focus on prevention. So I'm aware that the Crisis Care Concordat is now a mental health Concordat for Ts, and signatories have agreed to work together with an increased focus on prevention and the wider determinants of health. So I will just end there and I'll lead on to Richie, who can talk more about that kind of prevention-focused intervention. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. Everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm Richie Andrew. I work in public health in the mental health team as a health improvement specialist. And this is briefly what I'm going to outline for you today. So really what we're talking about today is I want to tell you about the evidence base around wellbeing and positive psychology and how that's influencing some of our thinking around the wellbeing network in particular, and pushing for an emphasis on wellbeing as the end goal that brings all the pieces of work together. But the first thing I want to mention is that actually, rather than just being seen as a response to COVID-19 and the impact of lockdown, the Wellbeing Network has been developed from a work stream that's been in my portfolio for the last 2 years. So local strategies influenced the work. There's been community conversations going on, engagement events that have been going on with Tube and many other providers. And the work stream itself is to develop a community asset-based approach for the 5 ways to wellbeing, and that's evolved to become the proposal for the Wellbeing Network. This approach is very much talking about a medium and long-term, very much long-term, permanent, really, approach to wellbeing, and that'll become. As I go into more detail, that'll become a little bit clearer. But the individual barriers to achieving wellbeing are really to be focused upon, but to connect people. Really, the ultimate aim of the Wellbeing Network is to try and give people purpose and meaning to their lives, and really very much emphasis on preventative for mental health problems becoming a problem that needs more advanced psychological services to help people deal with those issues. And then there's a series of asks which are integrated into the final couple of slides that Catherine's presenting on. Next slide, please. So wellbeing and happiness, is it even more important now? Well, I'd probably say probably not really, in terms of what we stand to gain by putting wellbeing at the core and endgame across all policy development. But actually, given the impact of lockdown, let alone COVID-19 and many other diseases responsible for our mortality rates, it's actually an opportune time to build on a population who have been very inward-looking for the last few months. Many reports on COVID-19 and well-being suggest that a lot of people are either reevaluating their lives. Perhaps they've been forced into reevaluating because of loss of employment, change of circumstances, breakdown of the family, whatever it might be. But actually, having spent a lot of time away from the rat race, if you like, for want of a better term, whether or not there's something there which they start looking inward, they're starting to recognise that there's a lot of self-care, there's a lot of personal responsibility that people can look at. And so we're looking to sort of take a lead from that. This slide here is a summary of Richard Layard is the founder of Action for Happiness. He's a scholar in the UK, and Martin Seligman, both professors themselves, is the lead in the US and internationally for positive psychology, which is well worth a look at. And there's 2 websites, Action for Happiness and the Authentic Happiness website at the bottom, and they cover, just those 2 areas cover a vast amount of research, particularly over the last 10 years, but very much over the last 20 years, around happiness, around life satisfaction, and around anxiety, and basically the biggest drivers for well-being. And so the question was asked during a recent webinar with them about what has the pandemic given us in terms of the discourse on well-being, and their thoughts were that it's given us an improved sense of solidarity. We're in this together, and we achieve solutions together. Raised awareness of the importance of our own agency for mental well-being. In other words, we don't just rely on services. In fact, let alone, most of us should never really rely on services. To prevent mental health, there's actually a huge amount we can do in our own lives. So mental well-being is our responsibility. That's part of the message, and there's perhaps more of a realization of that. Prove that things have been achieved rapidly that were not believed possible, whether it's red tape, bureaucracy, the drive, the need, the very immediate need, but things can be done when we absolutely need to, and brought us closer to what we most humanly value and are pre-wired for, and that's connection, ultimately, and a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. Next slide, please. So the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, this little logo at the bottom left of the slide, is if you're aware of NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. This What Works Centre for Wellbeing is the centre of evidence within the UK for wellbeing research. And so what we're doing is we're proposing that wellbeing can bring communities closer to policy and vice versa. We suggest that the board and the network strive, and the wellbeing network that I'm going to talk about in just a second, into using a well-being lens to all of our work as an endpoint in itself. And I'm going to keep reiterating that endpoint emphasis with approaches that we already know to tackle the wider determinants as a means to achieve this goal. You've heard a lot about the wider determinants. They're all means to an end, and the end probably is better well-being for everyone. Often the end game might be to get more people into employment, to get less people living in poverty, and so on. But actually, what all these things aim to do, they're all factors that increase people's well-being. Okay, next slide, please. So well-being is the goal. If we put well-being evidence at the heart of policy, there's a central evidence stream, and the World Happiness Report editor, Professor John Helliwell, is kind of determined to convince local authorities across the UK that if they look at their communities through the lens of well-being inequalities, they'll get a better idea of how people are coping or not, and why different groups, whether it's men or women, relative inequalities, young or old, are impacted in different ways. By no means are they the most relevant comparisons between different groups. But you can divide groups up in many thousands of different ways, and that's this is kind of just a couple of examples of how that can be done. So well-being is an essential complement to purely economic measures of success, particularly gross domestic product, GDP, and most people now recognise that this economic measures is sort of inadequate to account for so much of what is important in our lives. So to illustrate this a little bit more, here's 3 examples, for example, about how well-being focus in policy that's happened already nationally has meant shifting priorities. So within employment, obviously over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen massive, changes to the way employers value well-being of the staff. And actually, Middlesbrough Council, Redcar Council both have examples of how they invest in counselling, in well-being, in different practices which have an impact upon well-being. So they're great examples. There's always more that can be done on that. In terms of mental health, well, we've heard everything really about how mental health is a driver of well-being, but equally, not great well-being can be a driver of mental health problems as well. But that's hugely significant. But most significant, when you compare well-being measures between different countries, the most significant driver is loneliness. So in terms of having someone to rely on, and that's a very current topical thing, isn't it? In times of trouble is the biggest driver for the difference in well-being. So that's something really to really focus in on. And to give you an example of what I mean by well-being lenses at scale, is that at a small group grassroots level, so a community group level, let's take a small activity group, an arts group, let's say, we'll be encouraging them to sort of take into consideration 5 ways of well-being, basic measures around well-being, trying to find out more about those people who are members of the group, what their journey is are they employed, are they unemployed, where they're coming from, what's else is going on in their life, perhaps even capturing stories of the people that are engaging through that group, and finding out what actually is happening that's giving them meaning and purpose in their lives, and then sharing those stories and connecting them to others to do the same as well. A higher level policy example of well-being lens would be something you may be familiar with. So let me give an example of like a construction plan for housing. So from the very point that you have an inception of an idea about doing some new build, you might want a well-being lens would be asking questions such as where all the workers come from, are they local, how many local apprentices are going to benefit from this build, what local suppliers will gain from it, how the environment was designed from that build, how the local community will engage as part of it, the actual employers themselves who are contracted to do the construction, how do they look after the well-being of their employees, what community development was built into construction, and so on. It goes on. And actually, there are evidence ways to understand the measures of well-being, to take people through these processes, depending on what the nature and scale of the process is. So the next slide, measures and understanding success. These are 5 areas that go beyond GDP. So you may be aware that GDP obviously is very much about economic activity. These measures, everything from standard of living to public value particularly, look at additional measures that really are the things that matter to people. So GDP, as economic activity, includes black market activities, but last time I looked at it, it doesn't include voluntary productivity. So the 3.5 or so million volunteers in the UK are not included as part of GDP and what they give to the communities. So clearly that you need to go above and beyond that to understand. And so one example here, like public value, probably of all these different measures, which we can look at in more detail, this document here, Wellbeing Evidence at the Heart of Policy, goes into a lot more detail. But public value is very much about the quality of public policy outcomes with the total funding spent on those policies. So you understand the actual spending that's being done and how that relates to the value to the public for their own well-being. And that's some seriously useful measures to look at. Next slide, please. At the individual level for well-being, so this is like subjective well-being, this is what the evidence tells us matters the most to people's individual well-being. So you have 9 areas here. And actually, these are combined, so for example, if you have combined policies, practices, interventions, community activities that encompass more of these in combination, or if it's not a single activity that includes a lot of these in one combination, it's that people then are exposed to multiple activities that are better connected, that allows them to access improvements and give them the means to improve their lives in all of these areas. Okay, so that's what the evidence tells us, that what wellbeing factors matter the most. And when the Office of National Statistics measure wellbeing, they use these 9 and questions underneath it and indicators, but there's also a 10th, which is about the economy, which is mainly a national indicator as well. So these there's also these 4. If we move on to the next slide, yeah, that's it. So the 4 core ONS questions, these are the Office of National Statistics. Since 2011, they've been asking questions through the National Household Survey once every 6 months and collecting data around wellbeing in the UK. They've been doing it weekly during COVID and lockdown to try and gauge. And what we have seen over the last year, from April through to the end of March this year, is drops significantly in life satisfaction, in people's sense of worthwhile, happiness, and then increases in anxiety as well. I have to say, though, that generally speaking, there's some variations, and I've got the stats to share, but generally speaking, we're not quite as low with life satisfaction, worthwhile, and happiness as we were in 2011, shortly after recession and the bank bailouts and so on. And anxiety isn't quite as high as it was at that time. But those things are going in the wrong direction at the moment. But these are based on samples, fairly small samples from each town. They're okay to use in the town level, but you wouldn't compare yourself to other local authorities. We need larger amounts of data to make those comparisons properly. And those 4 questions are the ones that we would like to see as many activities across South Tees making better use of as well. And the way to do all this, on the next slide, is through a proposal that we launched a consultation on Tuesday this week. I think you will have all received an email to invite you to take part in that consultation for the proposal for a South Tees wellbeing network. And so we want to better connect people that work in wellbeing to enhance their work, prevent silo working, separation of activities, particularly that are trying to achieve the same outcomes, and actually bring together people who can collaborate and bring their own creativity and intelligence and experience to problems, solving problems around wellbeing where they've got, same experience, but they're just disconnected. We want to create a wellbeing community, and that's huge. I mean, that encompasses social care, healthcare, people that work in mentoring, people that work in any type of community, it's supporting people for the wellbeing. So it's huge. But we need that standardized messaging. We need standardized data to be coming out of communities to get that link. So we will promote community voices within that network through the methods. We already have experience in doing this with with community development locally. We want to create calls for innovation. So if we identify a need for a wellbeing need, mental wellbeing need locally, that might be identified perhaps through Dominic's services within Tuve. So they're getting a lot of referrals, for example, for a particular need, but it's not actually mental health caseness. It's not diagnosable issues, but it's a mental wellbeing need at the community level. Then you would open that up to the network and say, look, this is a problem. Who would like to be able to come forward and work collaboratively to try and solve this? And then, of course, you look at kind of innovation, you look at kind of funding to support that and move forward. But it hasn't really been done before. So it allows people who perhaps don't have as much of a voice in very small community VCS groups, but do some very good work around wellbeing to be part of that, and to volunteer to be part of that as well. And so, just to wrap up, you'll see much more detail in the consultation. It's a question answer document basically, which is about the proposal, and then you just answer 4 questions about that in a survey, and then we take that feedback and hopefully push on with the network after September. But these are the main 3 proposed functions. So promoting wellbeing activities themselves. We're not looking to create a new directory. We think we've got some good directories locally. We just want to make sure that everyone's better connected. Planning, capacity building and evaluation of wellbeing activities, and promoting campaigns purely around mental well-being. So this is not a network that has a great deal of interest in mental health. The separation is important to understand that mental health is very much about people experiencing problems with their mental health. Mental well-being is about those things that often people have can do within their own lives, but might need some barriers brought down to do those things that enable them to protect themselves from developing mental health problems. And I think probably most people can relate to that message. And then finally, identifying and meeting the gaps. And I think that's particularly where we see ideas all the time from around the world, really exciting solutions to well-being. We can bring those. This gives us a chance to bring those ideas forward and bring partners together to wrap around those solutions. So it's quite an exciting proposal, and I'm going to wrap up there because I can talk for England. So thanks very much.
So it's kind of come back to me now. So I'm conscious people have been very patient, and there's been a lot of information conveyed. So I'm just going to kind of rattle through the last few slides. So going back to the question earlier on from the chair in relation to, I think it was from the chair, sorry, in relation to kind of what have we done in terms of services. So I've just put some examples on this slide of some of the things that we've done from a Achieve perspective. Now, I'm very clear that this is only from a Achieve perspective, but we've done it in partnership with other stakeholders within the system. And I'm aware that this will just be scratching the surface of all of the things that have been done within South Tees in relation to, in response to trying to support people to maintain positive mental health and well-being, and in order to address some of the issues that people have been facing during the last 6 months. So, you know, we've had formed links with shielding hubs, we've provided psychological support with Acute Trust colleagues, we've launched the single number for all age crisis services across Teesside, we've introduced a listening service alongside that. We've also very much focused, picking up a little bit on Richie's point, we've very much focused on trying to enhance our pathways to VCS partners and trying to introduce processes whereby actually we almost do a warm handover. So if somebody comes to us and we then signpost them to the VCS, we actually do a follow-up to make sure that that contact has actually been achieved, rather than previously what we might have done was, or what we did do was, we'd refer somebody and then we would never really know whether or not they'd been able to kind of move through to access the service we'd identified. If you just want to flick on, Catherine. We've done a lot of work in terms of supporting care homes, which I think has been talked about within this meeting before, in terms of for people not only within the older population, but also within learning disability services as well. And we've also provided, in conjunction with a local VCS partner in public health, we've also provided some dedicated advice and input for Black and minority ethnic communities as well. And as I say, there are many other examples that can be highlighted as well. So that's kind of what's been done. If we move on to the next slide, kind of what else is kind of in the pipeline. So we're looking at the development of something called a resilience hub, which again, I think we need to think about the interface of that with things like wellbeing networks. And the idea behind a resilience hub is that it's a resource that's available to promote positive mental health and wellbeing for people who've had direct impacts of COVID. We're kind of thinking a little bit bigger than that over time in terms of whether it could then become a resource for mental health and wellbeing across the whole of the patch. And then there've been some specific developments, or there are further developments in terms of specific services that reach into places like James Cook and North Tees, and also specific pilot of work in terms of we're enriching to the primary care networks as well. So rather than being kind of separate from, we've got workers that are alongside the primary care networks to kind of use the flow back and forwards from primary and secondary care. So if we move on to the next slide, Catherine. I would hope that this presentation gives a clear sign that we are very much committed to thinking about it in terms of a system process. So as another example of that, we're working closely with Mark and Public Health around the Vulnerable Peoples Programme that they're developing to see what support and offer we can add there. We're also in conjunction with VCS providers, with the CCG and Public Health, we're looking at kind of school support. So what packages can be offered into the local schools for children and young people who are returning. And there are many other things, as I say, that are being planned or being talked about in terms of improving provision in light of what is likely to be the anticipated impact of COVID. So we were planning, if we move on to the next slide, Catherine. I think rather than do that, we'll just go to the ask and then close off to and then take questions from there. So I suppose in terms of the whole presentation, I suppose what's the ask? There's been an awful lot of information that's been provided, but I suppose trying to distill that down, what we're asking is that the mental health impact of the pandemic and lockdown receive the same attention and priority as the physical health impacts. We're asking the Health and Wellbeing Board to support the system to think long term in terms of mental health. This isn't something that's going to come and go in a short period of time. We'll be working on this in terms of COVID impacts for a significant period of time, but we know that in terms of emotional well-being, in terms of mental health and mental illness within South Tees, we know that we face some challenges pre-COVID anyway, so we really need to kind of maintain a focus over a significant period of time. And again, that we recognise that we have to tackle it as a system issue, and that the solutions we design are joint in order to prevent any single part of the system being overwhelmed. So if we don't interface with primary care will become overwhelmed. If we don't interface with VCS, there's the risk that we'll become overwhelmed, the risk that the VCS will become overwhelmed. We've got to basically pool our resources to be able to respond to this. And next slide. So again, just recapping some of Richie and Tina's points: to embrace and pursue wellbeing as a goal, and look at consistent measurement of wellbeing outcomes, to support the goals and implementation of the wellbeing network that Richie's just described. And again, I suppose it's that thing about being mindful that there will be additional national investment in mental health. We're aware of that as part of things like a mental health investment standard. But actually, even within that financial envelope, we might need to think about how we reprioritise some of our resource. We might need to think very differently about workforce composition and how we build on and support community assets, and also to consider how that mental wellbeing impact assessment can be embedded within policy planning and I suppose future commissioning arrangements as well. So I think that brings us to the end of what has been a very long presentation. So thank you for bearing with us. And we'll take any questions that anybody may have.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Thank you to Richie, Tina, Catherine and Dominic for that. It was amazing. There was an awful lot, and I don't know whether everybody feels the same. There was an awful lot to take in on there. I know we all have the presentation, so we can possibly look at it again to get the gist of everything in one go. But thank you for that anyway. But can I go now to Councillor Kay, who wants to ask a question before I ask mine?
Yes, well, if you want anybody to move the recommendations, I will do that, because I think we've had a most positive presentation, and it's nice. I've often complained that the Health and Wellbeing Board doesn't really do much, so this is an opportunity for us to take the initiative and show that we are positive and willing to do something, and even commit some resources to improving mental health in the South Tees area. I've cheered up a bit now, because I'm a big believer in people finding self-worth, and this we've been it's been explained to us that there is now a positive approach to bringing well-being to the people we represent. I think there were 5 issues here, ranging from standard of living down to public value. I think really you could possibly split them into 2. The first 3 are to do with economic viability, and the second 2 are to do with self-worth. But really you can't have one without the other, because if you're struggling with poverty, then it's very difficult to get a feeling of self-worth. It's not impossible, but for most people it will be very difficult. And I think this is what makes people happy, if you like, the fact that they feel they're contributing something to society, even if it's just in a small way, or even to their own families. Now, I have seen tables in the past about well-being and what various countries feel about the subject. The UK usually comes quite low down the list when compared with other European countries, and so I think we probably haven't been positive enough about this. We could learn a lot from Scandinavia. They're usually at the top when it comes to happiness and well-being. And as I say, I'm not sure. I have been to Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and I think they do seem to be happy communities. So let's try to learn something from them. But yes, I feel much better, and I do hope I'll get support in moving the recommendations that have been made to the Health and Wellbeing Board. Thank you.
I would like to second Councillor Kay's recommendations, but before we continue with that, I've got two people who would like to ask either a question or make a statement. Can we start with Councillor Mary Ovens, please?
Thank you. You're doing well to observe everyone. And it was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for that. And I echo what Steve said about pursuing well-being of health and not keep saying mental health problems. I want to go to the so everybody feels half full, not half empty attitude to life. But I was just noticing partnership working, and I didn't, we haven't had the police to come in or the ambulance, but we do hear that the police and the ambulance service pick up a lot of problems within mental health, and I'm sure we do work very closely to them and signpost them. The other thing was you identified those who do not access the services, and we were also talking about early intervention. I think that's really important, and there's been a few initiatives going around recently in Redcar and Cleveland. Councillor Kay and Patrick Rice visited a community-based asset in Grangetown yesterday, and there's possibilities and endless possibilities there of helping people. And Broughton Hospital has opened up its services, not necessarily to provide more officers or NHS workers, but to use what we have, but to centre it on a base. And I think this is about community response, because our boroughs are so very diverse, even within the borough, that there's going to be different responses to different places. And finally, sorry, I'm going on a bit. The other one was, we all know as ward councillors of little initiatives that are going on. Some of them have had to close down because of COVID, but others are still out there. And I think this survey and sort of mapping everything is really important, that we all pull together, because there's a lot of charity organisations, etc., that do offer support. Thank you very much. Sorry if I've gone on a bit.
No problem, Mary. Can I now go to Councillor Alison Barnes, please?
Thank you, Chair. My question, it may not be the right forum to ask this, actually, because it's not something that's been directly referred to, apart from sort of coincidentally, is to do with the wellbeing network. That we got a draft of the actual format it's going to take, and I've actually filled in the survey myself, but there was just one question that I had, which I thought perhaps Richie might be able to answer. That was to do with the evaluation. It actually says, we propose to utilise an evidence base from the world leaders on happiness, wellbeing and resilience to support our activities, and we intend to add to that evidence base to ensure that if the network is effective, we will know it is, so we can do more of it and we can make it public to enable other areas to make use of the content. My question was, what is this evidence base from the world leaders on happiness? I did try and look it up on the internet. I wondered whether it was anything to do with the World Wellbeing Project. which is comes out from, I think it's Pennsylvania University in America, or is it something totally different? I just wondered if he had that information to hand, please.
Hi there. If I'm okay to, Dorothy, yep. So within the presentation there, I know there was a lot to take in there, but there's one slide which I've put live links in for what works for the Action for Happiness, what works for well-being, Centre for Wellbeing, and Authentic Happiness. Now, Action for Happiness is a campaign based upon the evidence base of what works for well-being, broadly speaking. And the Centre for Wellbeing in the UK is exactly set up to gather and identify the gaps in well-being, in evidence for well-being. And so, I mean, anyone here can register for regular updates to what works for wellbeing and see the weekly updates that come out for a whole range of activities going on around the world, and the evidence as it grows. And you're quite right on the University of Pennsylvania. That is Martin Seligman's research home, basically. An Authentic Happiness website will take you through to the University of Penn website, where he's got a whole range of different resources you can use. The difference between the two is one is very much about well-being in a broader sense. So that's like the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. The Authentic Happiness website and all the evidence there is about positive psychology. And that's very much about practical activities that we can build in within our lives in different settings to change our cognition, basically, away from at a simpler level, away from more negative solutions to actually, seeking more positive solutions. And a very practical example of that would be the daily activity that Martin Seligman talks about, where you write down each day 3 things that went well and why they went well. And over 2 weeks, the evidence shows that these things, that activity can actually very much change your ability to focus more on the positives, for example. But that's something that we would, we can share this alongside thousands of other pieces of work and see where things go. So hopefully that answers your question. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really helpful. I did sort of note it down from the slide, so I will have a look at that. And as Mary was saying, we need to cultivate a glass half full idea rather than a glass half empty. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Is there anybody else would like to come in? No? So could I just follow up with a couple of questions? My first one is to Tina. Tina, you talked about a survey with many agencies.
Mm-hmm.
How many agencies are you talking about? And is there a chance when you get the results of these surveys that you could come back to the Wellbeing Board?
Yes, I can definitely bring the results back. So it hasn't gone to CHU. We haven't sent to the Mental Health Trust, but it's gone to a lot of our commission services, Mind, but we also want it to go to lots of small wellbeing grassroots organisations, smaller charities, those that have had funding, and those that are kind of very proactive in our communities, just so we get that whole kind of breadth of what's happening. We had one organisation came back and said it was a joy to complete, which was lovely to hear, that it meant that they had a voice. Because I thought people are going to be sick of surveys at the moment, but it was nice to get some sort of positive feedback. So that they're trickling through, but when we get them all collected, I'm happy to bring the findings back.
Yes, I would appreciate that. I then have something I would like to follow up on with Richie. Richie, you were talking about groups re-meeting up. It's unfortunate due to COVID that this isn't happening, because I do know in Middlesbrough we have lots of different places that people meet, groups that meet, and I'm sure it's exactly the same in Redcar, but due to COVID, and I think this will have had a huge effect on people. Have you found that?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's pretty clear when we look at the nature of well-being that lockdown and the measures around lockdown are pretty much the antithesis to good well-being. It's like if you wanted to prescribe something to happen to the nation that would be terrible for our well-being, then we've experienced it, basically. So look, the sooner, I mean, it's pretty clear we have come up with alternative solutions, haven't we, to connecting people. And it's interesting, alongside this piece of work, my other colleague, Sharon Chappell, who I'm working with from Redcar, who's equal lead within this work, is also doing some work around digital inclusion. So, I mean, it's about, isn't it? It's about giving people who don't have access to digital means like virtual meeting like this and so on, the means to access that. So Aging Better, for example, have been supporting, over 50. And that's the easy example to go to, but there are others as well. I mean, there's a smaller group called Whip It Up in Saltburn who have they've got a whole set of digital resources they can provide and loan to people who are taking part in their activities. We'd like to see a lot more of that as a solution. I'd like to see lockdown measures removed completely because it'd make our lives so much easier. But in the absence of that, the next best thing is that way of connecting. But even at a community level, we saw demonstrations of neighbourliness, of community activity happening to support people, like elderly people who might be isolated by themselves, being supported by the neighbours, those people who are shielded. I think there's a database there now, shielded, that would be incredibly useful to be able to use in all sorts of applications as well. But it's worth remembering that the Wellbeing Network is about working with those that work with the public. It's not a public network. It is very much about the collective community around those that support wellbeing and bringing those together. But other than that, I mean, other than the digital connections, I think that's probably trying to build on the community connections we've got face to face. Other than that, it's very difficult times, isn't it?
It is. Thank you very much for that, Richie.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to come in with anything? No. Yes.
Sorry, Dorothy. Leslie Stephen would like to speak, and PR6957 would like to speak as well. I'm not sure of their name though, so I wasn't quite sure.
Okay.
Indicated. Thank you, Chair.
Who was the first one? Leslie.
Yes.
Would you like to come first?
Leslie Spaven, Leslie Spaven from Middleton Voluntary Development Agency. Just one very quick question. When in the presentation earlier on you talked about the additional demands, but I was just wondering because carers wasn't mentioned in there. I just wondered when you did the modelling for prediction of demands, whether carers' needs were taken into account in that. And the other one was just a general reflection. Although there isn't much reference to the VCS, I acknowledge that through the presentation, all the speakers have made a reference to the VCS, and I just wanted to obviously reflect that that is a really critical part, and there are lots of VCS organisations out there that are supporting the mental wellbeing agenda, so we need to reflect that as part of the whole system. And just that obviously there are other forums that exist out there, so within Middlesbrough we've got a mental health partnership where I'm assuming that these discussions will also be useful to take place in those kind of forums, and obviously today's discussions will help shape the discussions that hopefully will take place across some of those other forums as well.
So I wonder if I can on that one. So in terms of the first point around carers, it's absolutely focused on people who will be presenting to mental health services. Now, a number of those individuals could be carers, but for a significant, who develop mental health problems as a result of some of their experiences as well. So I think that probably comes through in some of the kind of vicarious impacts that we talked about early in the presentation. But you're absolutely right. For all of those people who will be presenting, there will be impacts on the system around them, their families, the people, their social networks, and impact in terms of carers as well. So, but that's not specifically articulated and described in that modelling. So that's a helpful point. I think in terms of your point around the VCS, absolutely. I think one of the things we'd like to be really clear about is this presentation is just meant to start the discussion. And, you know, I hope I was at pains to point out that there's elements of it that are very tube-centric, there's elements of it that are very public health-centric, but the reality is it has to be a whole system. So I've shared this previously with Eric and Patrick, and also with the DCSs as well. And I think we need to just keep building on this presentation in terms of being able to describe what that whole system response needs to look like. So absolutely. And again, we didn't go into descriptions of governance structures, etc. But you're absolutely right. This needs to go into lots of different meetings that take place across South Tees in order to inform what our future planning and response to this is.
Can I come in as well, Leslie? Sorry, I just wanted to say on the nature of VCS, the Wellbeing Network proposal is very much community facing, and I think, I mean, our vision for it, if it goes ahead, is to see that it's actually got the greatest membership of VCS, statutory services, private sector as well. I've mentioned about workplace, and actually, I think if anything, we want to give the VCS its due, because it provides just a huge amount of the wellbeing efforts locally, and I think a lot of what we'll learn locally will be from those conversations we'll have in the network when we put a request out there. What comes back is going to tell us what I think we know, which is there's a lot of activity going out there that we just don't know anything about, and it isn't connected properly to those processes that it needs to be. It definitely will go. Actually, I'm a bit one of the things we're nervous about with the network is actually getting it right in terms of definitely not stepping on anyone else's toes and providing something which isn't currently being provided. So those conversations and the consultation are essential. We're not rushing it, that's for sure. We want to make sure we get it right rather than rush it. I just wanted to mention one other thing for Dorothy, really, but your question about connections during lockdown is that it's worth remembering the 5 ways to wellbeing and the Every Mind Matters campaign, which have been modified during lockdown to give people a stack of ideas, practical ideas in terms of how they can build wellbeing into their lives, whether it's physical activity, staying connected with those people that might be lonely, whether it's just on the telephone, and so on. So 5 ways to wellbeing and Every Mind Matters is something we should all be pushing as much as we can as well.
Would you like to introduce yourself, please? Oh.
Is it me? That's my question. Sorry, it's Patrick Rice from Redford Council. I don't know why it doesn't come up with my name. I suppose I think it was all brilliant, and this holistic population type of response and prevention is great. But at the start of the presentation, there was very clearly an issue around children. And I noticed there was something in the report about some packs going to school, but there didn't seem to be a great deal of focus on young people, in terms of gathering the evidence. It seemed to be much more around working age adults. And really, I suppose my question was, a lot of money has been distributed to the NHS, local government through COVID, but has money filtered down to services like CAMS? Because obviously CAMS was under pressure before COVID started. And so the question around it, is there more money for CAMS? And really, I do agree with the population-wide approach, but there is clearly an issue around young people, which didn't quite, for me, seem to get quite the same focus in the actions as opposed to where some of the need was.
So I think if I come back on that one, Patrick, so I think in terms of the presentation towards the end, we did have to rush that, I think, just in terms of timing. In terms of the question about focus on children and young people, absolutely, there's an enormous focus on children and young people at this point in time. But is it enough is a fair question. And again, it's that focus on children and young people across the whole system. So in terms of the question about has more money come into the system for children and young people, absolutely has. So there's a national mental health investment standard that has been described, which requires that mental health investment increases year on year. Within that, there's a requirement that investment within children's services grows faster and at a greater proportion than it does within the other aspects, which is a recognition that children's services have traditionally been underinvested in. So the money is coming. Is it enough? That's an arguable point. The other point I would probably make again is back to systems working together. There's something around, actually, we can throw as much money as we like at the problem, but if we can't work as a joined up system, there's still going to be cracks that people will fall through. So that's absolutely an area of focus. And I think there's been some really good work that's happened within children's services, not only in terms of the inreach into schools and the support that's been offered there, but also some of the work that's gone on during lockdown with the VCS, which has been, in terms of enhancing those links and pathways between kind of statutory services and the VCS. And I know similarly from a local authority point of view, the local authority children's services are very much linking up and engaging with CAMS as well. So we're moving in the right direction. Are we moving at the pace that we need to? I think that remains to be seen.
Eric, would you like to come in now?
Thanks, Dorothy. I mean, my apologies, everyone. I've been tied up in other meetings, so I only came in at the tail end of what Dominic was saying just before Patrick's question. I mean, I've obviously seen much of the work that Dominic's been talking about that's been shared with myself and Patrick before, and absolutely in agreement with everything that's been talked about. I think there's been lots of really good working going on across agencies through the period of pressure since March with COVID. I think it's very, very easy for us just to kind of retreat back to our organisational silos, and we've got a clear responsibility to make sure that we don't fall into that trap. So you have me at a slight disadvantage, Dorothy, because I've come to the meeting so late today, but in support absolutely of what Dominic's saying. You're on mute, Dorothy.
Eric, you're absolutely correct. Can everybody hear me now?
We can now, Dorothy, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. So, do we have to vote on this report or decide that we accept it?
Yes, I think we can just accept that report as presented, Dorothy.
Right. Can we all accept that report as presented? Yeah? Put our hands up. Thank you. Right, can I just ask you, Catherine, is there anything we have to move forward with after this report?
Thanks, Councillor Davison. I think with the support of the board now, what we'll endeavour to do is take away those very broad actions as part of the ask and try and unpack that a little bit about what the practical implications and next steps on those might be. So with the board's permission, we'll now go ahead and do that.
Does everybody agree to that, please? Thank you very much. Now, we're a little bit late, so the next thing we go to is item number 6, which is the Executive Chair's report, but I think it's going to be presented by... Who is presenting this one for us, please? Craig. Craig, are you presenting this?
Yeah, I'll give a through the for information. I'll give you a brief flavour of what's included and then try and respond to any questions. So in terms of the report from the executive this time out, there's an update provided on the Better Care Fund for 2021, and unfortunately, because of the situation with COVID, we've not received any further policy guidance as of yet. So we're just continuing to work through the previous guidance and the programme of work that we'd set out, focusing on the 4 priority areas included within the BCF of reducing non-elective admissions, reducing delayed transfers of care, trying to reduce permanent admission to residential homes, and supporting increasing reablement opportunities. There's also a section within the report on the PNA, the pharmaceutical needs assessment, and usually we would be required to publish a renewed PNA. Unfortunately, again, because of the impact of COVID, the decision's been taken nationally to suspend that until April 2022. So just to make members aware of that, and that there won't be a refreshed PNA coming through the board anytime soon before 2022. There's a rather comprehensive update in the report around the work of Healthwatch South Tees, which includes an update on work that they've undertaken to date, sets out some priorities for the remainder of 2021, but also sets out some clear actions that have been undertaken and some engagement work that they've undertook during the pandemic, which is really useful and informative, and something that we can all collectively pick up on. There is a section within the report on flu and our preparedness for flu, outlining the regional approach across the North East and Cumbria, a local response across Teesside and the Tees Valley, and also setting out what the role of our practices and primary care networks could be or may be as we move forward with that. I think there is an ask within there around ensuring that partners, wherever possible, can support with the flu vaccination programs, and the executive will be looking for support right across the health and wellbeing partnership to look at how we can make most effective use of the resources we've collectively got to make sure that we get as many people as possible vaccinated in this winter, which we expect to be particularly challenging given the impact of COVID on top of the usual winter pressures. The final section of the report basically details progress against the South East Health and Wellbeing Board priorities. I wasn't going to run through those individually, but I would like to draw your attention to the section on the winter planning arrangements that we've put in place across south of Tees and indeed across the broader Tees Valley in preparation for the winter, touching on some of the issues I've just mentioned around flu, really, making sure that we're in the best possible position to work together collaboratively across all partners, both health and social care, to make sure that our system's in the best possible position to respond to the anticipated winter pressures, but also any resurgence of COVID across our localities. So I think that was about it in terms of highlights, but happy to try and take any questions or to work with colleagues who are also at the executive, Eric and Patrick, to respond to anything that might come up.
Questions? There's one small thing I would like to ask. What have you got in place to try and get more people to have the winter vaccination? Is the advert, or what are you going to do to encourage people?
Yeah, absolutely, Dorothy. There's a regional campaign, there's a national campaign, a regional campaign, and also some local communications that we're putting out. And there are examples of some of those within the pack as well, within the report. So we'll be going out in local media through social media outlets, and we'll look at other opportunities for using various formats and forums to get the message out there to the right people. Clearly, this year, given things are a little bit different in terms of what's happening out in the community with COVID, that there's a real push and a desire to get as many people vaccinated as possible, not only from the vulnerable groups, but also from anybody aged 50 plus as well. So it's really important that we work with as many voluntary and community sector groups, as many of our partners as possible, to get the message out there around who needs to be vaccinated and how they can access a vaccination.
Ideas GPs are going to start the vaccination program, or chemists, or any information on that?
So we'll obviously continue to work with the usual outlets, so GPs, pharmacies, etc. Given the vaccination. At the moment, we're waiting for the vaccine to arrive. So as you'll be aware, there's a process that we work through for the vaccine to be formulated. Once supplies are available, then they're distributed out to health services, and then we can start vaccinating. So that should happen later this month.
Mary, would you like to come in now?
Sorry, it was just a comment on that I've actually arranged to have my flu jab at a certain chemist, well known on High Street, Boots, and I couldn't get in till the 24th, and I hadn't heard anything from my surgery, but presumably they're hoping that the vaccine will be in by then. But certainly they were already pretty fully booked, and they seem to have quite a specific agenda as to who could have it, because I know sometimes there are other people rather than those over, say, 60 or 65, whatever it is, who do need that extra protection, like young people with extreme asthma and that. But perhaps that'll be best dealt with through their GP surgeries. But there we are. Thank you.
That's right, Mary. The criteria has been broadened this year to try and vaccinate as many people who would be as vulnerable as possible. So anybody over the age of 50 and certain groups or skilled children as well will be asked to get the vaccination.
Okay, thank you.
now, please?
Sorry, Dorothy, you're on mute there. Councillor Alison Barnes would like to come in.
Yeah, it was just to say that my GP practice has arranged vaccinations on the 19th and the 26th of September, and they've also got in place some arrangements to mop up those. They're starting off with the over 65s and then going on to the younger people. And the patients panel is involved, and I'm on the patients panel of sort of in a high vis jacket outside, hoping it doesn't rain, to chivvy people along.
Well done, well done, thank you. Is there anybody else yet, please? No? Thank you for that presentation, Craig. Much appreciated. Now we'll come to more or less the end of the meeting. I'll just follow my notes that Catherine's given me. So is that the end of the meeting, Catherine? Caroline and Sue, is that the end of the meeting?
Yes, Chair, just clarify the time and date of the next meeting. I think there was a slight typo on the agenda. So
So the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 17th of December at 3 p.m. Can that be noted, please?
That was an error. It's actually 2 p.m, the same as this meeting. They've rescheduled them for all of this year, so it'll be 2 till 4 every time.
Right.
It was 3 o'clock last year.
Yeah.
My apologies there. Sorry, Dorothy.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and thank you for the presentations. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Caroline, should we stay on?